Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start this panel. I would love to thank your attendance. Given the time, it is quite a struggle at 4 p.m. It's hard. So thank you for being here. I also wanted to mention, knowing this has been broadcast on streaming and other people are following us, I want to thank also all the people who are following this session live in streaming who couldn't make it here. But you're nevertheless making the effort to take part at 4 p.m. on a Saturday, which is a very uncivil hour. It's siesta time in Spain, as you know, so it's hard. This panel has been organized by the Democratic Movement of Women in Spain, which is the federation, the organization linked to the International Democratic Federation of Women. And we have with us comrades from the World International Democratic Federation, the Women's International Democratic Federation, have made every effort to be here with us today. The theme of this panel is women's unity in the struggle against imperialism. As you may or may not know, historically, the WIDF is born with this idea to fight for peace and disarmament at a time when the Second World War had just finished. And in that sense, women who make up WIDF and its various organizations fight against imperialism. This is a struggle that's deeply anti-patriarchal. Imperialism is deeply, deeply patriarchal, and it affects directly the lives and the rights of women. This is why we have with us here women who represent the federation, different regions in the federation, and different realities. Women who also suffer imperialism in their own lives. Of course, we want to explain imperialism on the basis of people's own realities and experiences, and we want to explain, confirm how imperialism is deeply patriarchal and impacts women's lives and women's reaffirmation of their rights. It goes against that. As women and as working class women particularly. We've got with us Regina to my right, who's a member of the WIDF Secretariat, and she represents the Democratic Movement of Women in Portugal. These are comrades we've been working with for years now, and we have very close collaboration, friendship, and solidarity, as well as working ties with them. And then we have Alicia Campos, who is the coordinator of WIDF for the America and Caribbean region. She's a member of the Cuban Federation of Women, and she's come all the way. She's made this long trip to be able to be with us today. Also to my right, we have Elena Galán, who's a member of the Democratic Movement of Women. She comes from the Andalusia delegation, and today she'll be the rapporteur for this panel. To my left, I've got Lorena Peña, who is the president of the WIDF worldwide. And she belongs to WIDF in El Salvador. And again, she's made quite a long journey to be here with us. And last but not least, we've got Ivory. It is a treat for us to be able to have her with us sharing, because unfortunately Nirva Camacho, who was supposed to be with us, has had problems she couldn't solve, last-minute problems, even though she made every effort to be able to come here today. Nirva Camacho, our comrade, Vice President of the American Caribbean WIDF region from WIDF-Venezuela, hasn't been able to make it here today, and so we've got Ivory speaking on her behalf. She also comes from WIDF-Venezuela, and again, she's traveled all the way from her country to come share with us live. And then, finally, but not least important, we've got Ada, who is the Vice President of WIDF in the European region. She belongs to WIDF Italy, and again has come, as Regina has, Regina Marques, they've come specifically to share, even though they come from slightly closer geography. So I would give the floor to Regina Marques to begin with, from WIDF Portugal, the Women's Democratic Movement of Portugal is represented by her. Good afternoon, everybody. I apologize because I speak somewhat mixed Spanish, but I'll do my best to be understood. We have a debate about the unity of women for peace and in the struggle against imperialism. This is indeed a problem we're facing, the NATO problem, and we know very specifically in a few days NATO is going to come to Madrid and hold a summit, an official summit here. And we put forward an anti-summit to say no to NATO, to say no to the current NATO policies. So I would start by saying NATO is the armed wing of imperialism. It knows no borders or boundaries. It's lost its initial Atlantic vocation. It has expanded and wants to install more weapons and military bases in Europe, in the Eastern European territories, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It seeks to extend its influence and to spread its tentacles throughout the planet, imposing military intervention to all kinds of emerging problems, be it social or political. To that end, they've been at NATO expanding their strategic concept. We may remember the Lisbon summit in 2010. This was a summit where everybody among them said was very strategic and historical, because it brought about an expansion of the reasons or the mandate for intervention. It can undertake cyber attacks, for instance. Cyber attacks are from one country to another, but cyber attacks can come directly from the NATO powers. This is why we live in very dangerous times, because of uncertainty, because of the war-waging forces and their constant intervention. we're living in dangerous times because there is a refusal to dialogue and a fostering of war by the US and other European countries, like, for instance, now the UK. In a nutshell, as a consequence, we must not forget the violent war in Kosovo, in Europe. Today's war, the war in Ukraine, is not the first war. And in Kosovo, with the dismantling of the former Yugoslavian Republic in 1988-89, the NATO brutal intervention remained with the idea of destabilizing Europe, always under the auspices of the US. In the last 20 years, we've witnessed an increase in terrorist attacks with military and political support. Organized military organizations, jihadists and other, coups d'etat, disrespect and violation of rights and freedoms, political gross meddling in countries that legitimately seek out alternative ways and try to defend their independence and their sovereignty. The imperialist offensive led by the United States, NATO, and the European Union expands to all continents, as we were saying. There's an increased militarization and deployment of military bases, foreign military bases. And this comes hand in hand right now, and for quite some time, with economic war and financial war. The goals, the main goals, or targets rather, are Russia and China. Beyond this, there is a very particular media war based on fake news, manipulation and distortion of facts. In that context, it is always women and girls who are the most vulnerable and the most impacted on all dimensions of their lives. Imperialism today attributes to the war in Ukraine all the evils in the world, including the food crisis, the climate crisis, the increase of poverty, which is on the rise, the lack of oil and gas, and all problems and troubles. Every day we see on screen news about destruction, refugees, displaced populations, particularly women and children who have been banned from their homes, and it obviously generates indignation and gives us a very chilling feeling to witness all this. Nevertheless, it is important to remember, and we don't want to minimize any war with this, but it is important to remember the wars that happened already in Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq, only to mention the ones that took place on the 21st century, with the direct responsibility of the United States and the involvement of NATO and its allies, with millions of people having been displaced and suffering, being the victims, and with the ensuing loss of lives, like the lives lost in the Mediterranean Sea, as we've been witnessing for quite some time. This is why women's struggle against imperialism is the struggle for peace and for a betterment of the living conditions of the peoples. This is a struggle for equality. Imperialism plays with terror, with fear, with the increase of hunger as war weapons. And we rely on cooperation relations, on friendship, collaboration, dialogue, mutual respect in order to solve national or international conflicts. On the other hand, we continue seeking out new weapons in the world, more sophisticated, more destructive. And we see constantly that there is reference to nuclear weapons manufacturing and even use. So from where we stand today, we must say militarism does not serve women's goals or women's emancipation. The world is mindful of the violations and the violence women are subject to in all armed conflicts to the hands of the very military forces. Rape as a war weapon is used in all countries affected by armed conflicts, and they are performed by forces to the service of NATO, even the UN, blue or white helmets, troops, as per their own reports. According to Resolution 1325 of the Security Council of the United Nations, states should take into account the gender dimension. This is important for us because there is tremendous hypocrisy around this. We could talk about this. NATO justifies its proposal, its current proposal, that is to not include women because military operations require a diversity of qualifications, resources, and skills, be it female or male personnel, which are key for the efficiency of operations. According to them, they say they work on the integration of the gender dimension in all aspects and in all operations they undertake, with a view to include women in their security forces, their ops forces as heads of missions or in the command line. The very Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, declared this desiderata lately with great concern around the inclusion of women in military operations. It is true that women must be present, in my opinion, in our opinion. Women must be present everywhere, in all spheres of life, should they wish to. But how? That's the question. We reinstate that the women at the service of NATO are not agents for peace. These are always executors of war, of the breaching of rights and freedoms, and the inclusion of women in the NATO lines of command seeks out to give more coverage to its unfair actions. Recently, women fighting for equality in their rights tried to alleviate their resistance and indignation in the face of this situation. For instance, as an example, I can mention Portugal. In Portugal, being a woman is not enough to defend peace. Today, we have a Ministry of Defense who happens to be a woman from the Socialist Party in Portugal, who has now stepped away from this hegemonist, European, Western-driven policy defended by the government. It is very interesting this for us because we are in Europe, and the idea would be to impose on others their idea of democracy and values. What's at stake is the conditioning and the confusing of women and their organizations, which very much are at the forefront in fighting for rights, quality of life, and peace. Contrary to what the imperialist propaganda tells us, we know there are more and more demands by women about all kinds of rapes and abuses linked to wars to which women are subject. This is why we're here we believe peace is possible in the name of the rights of women and the inviolability of their human condition. We are women. We are WIDF women, united and committed to the cause of peace, cooperation, progress, and social justice, which are necessary requirements for the dignified life of women in our countries and around the world. We're fighters for the right to equality in law and in life. And let me finish by saying that we have to be thankful. We have to thank our friends from WDF Spain, their invitation. We must thank all the women in feminist organizations present for their determination and courage in fighting for the rights of women to work, to housing, to health, to education, against fascism and war. And as we know, fascism is on the rise in our countries, against colonialism, neo-colonialism, against racism, against apartheid. We want to fight for self-determination and autonomy of women, the self-determination of the peoples. So we commend the fight of women for peace, for economic independence and human dignity. Women in different countries in Europe and around the world are fighting for the rights to work, which is very important, of course, because women need to be independent in order to be free. the rights to equal pay, which continues to be a problem in Europe, the improvement of their salaries and their careers, important public services, and the progressive deterioration of the situation of women when it comes to, for instance, public health services. For instance, in my country there is a tremendous war too, because there's increasing numbers of women dying, giving birth because of the deteriorating conditions in the healthcare system. And so we're here determined to defend the sexual and reproductive rights of women too. And it is very timely to talk about it today when in the United States they've put an end to those rights with the Roe v. Wade Act that allowed abortion, which was a beacon of light for us all, and they've put an end to this act. And this is again a campaign against women. We must fight back. We defend the healthcare conditions, the dignity conditions of women in healthcare. Medicine is very much evolved and advanced and must be at the service of women and peace. Thank you very much. Thank you, Regina. And now we're going to give the floor to Ada Donno, Vice President of WIDF Europe. Thank you. Thank you, Cristina. Good afternoon, comrades. I would like to add a few reflections, quick reflections, with regards to the theme of the unity of women against imperialism, which is a very, very long topic. If we could, we would talk for hours, as Regina already shared. There's so many of us, I forget the names. So first, with regards to the political times we live, they are key times, these times we live in. It would appear we are at a watershed moment. The war in Ukraine and the economic consequences of sanctions against Russia that will impact mainly Europe have heightened the existing inequalities in Europe and the discriminations due to neoliberal policies and the imperialistic single pole world order head by the United States. Now, the alternative to all that right now is either patriarchal, authoritarian, militarist capitalism present in all political spaces, criminalizing social protests and renewing the brutal concentration of wealth in a few hands, destroying nature, commercializing with every life reproductive structures, and launching new arms races and wars. That's one option. And of course, in that option, social rights and women's rights will suffer a setback, or the alternative, which is the peoples and the women's of the world joining a big alliance that reaffirms a notion of demilitarized human security, as it was very rightly put in the panels that opened the sessions yesterday and this morning. I think feminists, nevertheless, have something to say, something essential to say about all this, because we are the ones who have always, right from the start, questioned the old patriarchal order based on the capitalist accumulative system that during centuries has excluded and marginalized women. I mean, the WIDF feminism is a world movement able to combine the gender vision with the class vision. Gender struggles with class struggles, and a vision that wants for everybody to be able to live life with dignity in a healthy environment, in an equitable, fair and peaceful society, in true security, human security conditions. It is our commitment to build women's networks that are stronger every day in order to tackle the issue of security with a gender perspective, with a particular focus on the needs of the most vulnerable communities around the world. In Europe, in my case, but around the world. And so us women need to urgently establish these actions. Who is going to pay for the crisis that Europe is experiencing? Measures have been taken already in Italy, in Europe too, in the EU. And something's very clear. Every European government and the EU at large want exploited working classes, women, migrants, marginalized communities to be the ones paying for the crisis. Measures taken by governments and the EU have as its main goal to save the financial capitalist system, the big companies and the banks. European countries are heavily indebted. There's high levels of public debt to face the crisis. And who is going to pay for that phenomenal debt? The EU's intention is for popular classes to pay for all this. The pandemic has made it very clear. It's brought to the eyes of women this contradiction without the possibility of reconciliation between human life and the capitalist system, between the life of women and the privatization, wild neoliberal policies. The situation tells us that we need deep social and political changes, and we must prepare for a great lasting struggle, because going back to normal, after the pandemic was actually a normal situation, quote unquote, with greater inequality, more exploitation and more public debt. It would be foolish to ask capitalism to solve the problems it has itself caused: poverty, inequalities, environment deterioration. Those are all the creation of capitalism itself. So we need an alternative human security concept, non-militarized, based on the security of people, without discrimination, without marginalization. The only security that guarantees equality of rights for all individuals and peoples must be built on the basis of the right to health, on the basis of action plans inspired in solidarity, international cooperation, and the exchange of scientific and technological expertise and knowledge. Let me conclude on an optimistic, hopeful note, looking into the future. In Europe, a new generation of men and women is growing, and they are preparing to close the chapter of 5 centuries of imperialistic domination around the world. There are signals of a tremendous social unrest, deep unrest, and signals of change in the world order as it is. This deep social unrest says that this existing order and the life on the planet cannot coexist. As we say, as women say at the WIDF too, if we feel the present is a disaster, we must take heart, because the future is not written yet, and our struggles will determine what it will be like. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Ada. Well, now we're going to give the floor to Ebony from WIDF in Venezuela. Thank you, Cristina. Well, we always get really excited when I hear Regina and Ada, right? But first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. And I'd like you to know that the Vice President of WIDF for Latin America and the Caribbean wanted to be with us today, but she sent her presentation. I'm going to read it for you right now. So the presentation that she talks about is women in resilience or in resistance against the imperial abuse or assault. So Venezuela is always a core topic, isn't it? So Venezuela is constituted in a democratic and socialist state of law and justice. According to the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, associated to the respect of human rights, sovereignty, and self-determination of peoples. And in loyal compliance of the Magna Charter, the revolutionary government led by the constitutional president Nicolas Maduro guarantee peace and security of Venezuelan people, where the women people play a key role with the protagonistic participation in the defense of the homeland. Women organized have become stronger, and we have created new forms, new organizational forms. So organized women have become stronger, and we have created new organizational forums with diverse flags of fight in order to support social transformations that are necessary and are promoted by the revolution for the reduction of inequalities amongst them and in classes and in gender. One of the flags of fighting the Venezuelan women is the right to live in peace in a free and sovereign homeland. In such a sense, we become vigilant and mobilized in the face of the constant abuse to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela by the U.S. empire. From the arrival of the revolution of Commander Hugo Chavez, the situation has become worsened when Nicolas Maduro took power. The Venezuelan people have been stronger in the face of coercive measures that have been unilateral, and they've been imposed by the government of the U.S. with a brutal economic and financial bloc in the middle of a pandemic that is asphyxiating the entire humanity. In these conditions, the women have performed a protagonistic role, promoting new production empowerment and entrepreneurship activities, actively participating in the fight against COVID-19, and they led of the Bolivarian government, reaching one of the highest levels of control of the pandemic worldwide. There were 552 coercive unilateral measures, very directioned in the area of petrol, finance, food. But in the year 2021, Venezuela, with the conscience of our people that started working in the productive route, we moved from importing 80% of our food to producing 93% of the food that we consume. This is a state, a quote by Delcy Rodriguez, the Vice President of the Republic. This was stated on the 17th of June 2022. Women in the Bolivarian Revolution. Well, the fight of women in Venezuela has lasted centuries, but its participation in different processes was silent by history, which was mainly written by men. Its protagonism in the history of our country is viewed by Commander Hugo Chavez, who recognizes and promotes the participation of our ancestors in the independence fights and the contribution of women to the construction of socialism of the 21st century. The Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela since 1999 opened up new political and social routes, and it stated the basis of a participatory democracy model, which was also protagonistic, multi-ethnic, and pluricultural. It is the first constitution written in non-gender-based language as a whole. We have different scenarios in the national life, written in 22 years of revolution, achievements in law, institutional aspects, political aspects, and organizational aspects. And this is explained in legislative with the visualization of a gender language in our constitution, Article 88, recognizing the domestic work as an economic activity. The law on the rights of women to a life free of violence as a second reform, 2021, the law for the protection of families, maternity and paternity, the law for promotion and protection of maternal breastfeeding, the organic law of employment for male and female workers. Yes, there. Sorry, it's just the Venezuelans who speak very fast, don't we? Regarding the institutional, we created the National Institute for Women, the Bank of Women's Development, the Ministry of Popular Power for Women and Gender Equality. There are missions that have been specifically created to provide care for women. For example, Mission Hogares de la Patria, Homeland Homes, that was created in order to eradicate extreme poverty. The creation of courts and a specialized legal spaces specialized in violence against women. Politically, women in the Constitutional National Assembly in 1991, out of 131 members, 16 were women at the time and 115 were men. So we represented 12.2%. In the Constitutional National Assembly in 2017, women already represented 27.1% and women were 72.8%. Currently, in the National Assembly of our country, women represent 40% of the legislative process of our country. So this is a key indicator of that progress. With regards to the organization, we have the Constitution of the Presidential Council of the Popular Government of Women, which is a space for direct interacting of women organized with the President of the Republic. The setup of the National Union of Women, the incorporation of women organized in Una Mujer, and CLAP, which are the local committees of production. We play a key role in providing food to our country, and the great mission of sovereign provision. We also have the promoters of the care program of humanized birth giving and the National Congress of Women that is currently being developed. All women are being organized, and we've also had an international chapter not that long ago with the presence of WIDF there. So the participation of Venezuelan women in the political and social life in Venezuela is an evidence of a fight performed by millions and millions of women in the world who dream with more just and human societies, which has allowed us to reduce inequality, and in some countries more than in others. These demand more actions in the unity of women in order to build a world of peace. Women together for the freedom of peoples. In Latin America and the Caribbean, historically, women have fought in order to dismantle dictatorships against discrimination, racism, fascism, patriarchy, and imperialism. However, right in the 21st century, we're still facing oppression, margination, gender violence, not just at home, but also in the policies of the capitalist system and the policies of the large economic, political, military, and imperial powers. These 2 years of pandemic have been an unprecedented crisis, and this was added to the deepening of the imperialistic aggression to free and sovereign peoples who don't accepting the mandate of large powers. With the conditions of lockdown and economic difficulties, psychological and physical violence against women and rapes at home has increased in a very high at a very high rate in capitalist countries. Despite the adversities, united women continue fighting against sovereignty of our countries or against imperialism and for the freedom of our peoples. In the middle of the world crisis, North American imperialism and their allies in the NATO have shown a great lack of interest for the survival of most of the populations of the 5 continents, and even that of those who live in their own countries and neighboring borders. The 10 founding countries of NATO committed themselves to defend each other mutually in the case there was an armed aggression against each one of them. However, since it was created in 1949, the NATO has invaded 55 countries, and its key or goal, led by the US, is the destruction of those countries that deny accepting their mandate. Any country signing its independence is subject to a change of regime by the NATO bloc, just like has happened in many countries. Under the false narrative of defending democracy, respecting law, security, and promoting peace in the peoples, the NATO acts under the remit of the US, aiming to take control of areas of oil and other natural wealth in order to ensure the energy provision for the U.S. and its allies. The actions of NATO and its ally, the U.S., are not in search of peace. They are military interventions and invasions, and they are in order to implement changes in the governments and in order to destabilize certain countries that don't agree with their interests. Their operations of forced occupations and bombardments have an impact on infrastructures and civil population. They attack hospitals, schools, ports, and oil wells. There is a clear violation of human rights of the population, particularly the most vulnerable ones. Third age, youth, boys, girls, women, and therefore there are wars, there are crime wars. So as the NATO intensifies war, sanctions, and militarism, women are the first ones to face armed conflicts. They force displacements, violence, rapes, lack of resources, lack of food, water, medicines, amongst others. And for these reasons, the women in the world must get together against the imperialistic invasion of our territories and for our sovereignty. We cannot allow women that are in war conflicts created by the incredible ambition of the NATO members led by the US to be detaining prisons and war camps where they are abused in many ways. As migrants and refugees, they face the danger of being enslaved, abused, and murdered. We, female women, Afros, indigenous, workers, fisherwomen, peasants, female workers, we have dedicated over 2 decades to lead and fight in the front line against imperialism in the defense or for the Bolivarian revolution of Hugo Chavez, for the respect of our independence as a sovereign people. Our resistant forces continues to grow despite the bloc and the coercive unilateral measures that we've been suffering by the US and its allied countries. The women in the world committed to peace must close our links in the cases that we share, strengthening organizational instances like the Democratic Federation, the WIDF, women of left parties, etc., as spaces of articulation created by participating women in the anti-imperialistic space and any other space that we may encounter each other. And in order to conclude, we believe that there are some challenges. These are only some of those associated to this panel, and I'm sure there will be other opinions. We believe that it is important to set out efficient measures in order to suppress all forms of violence, forced labor and slavery suffered by women in the war zones. We must take on the commitment to defend equality as the right for all individuals, and we shouldn't tolerate the violations of human rights and the injustice suffered by women, girls, boys, young people, and adults in the areas where the NATO intervenes. We must make progress in the articulation of movements of women on the left worldwide, allowing for the construction of a great support force to the governments that fight against imperialism and pressure to those who go on their knees against it or in front of it. We must let the fight against the imperial in the political and economical aspects as a strategy to fight poverty, which has been imposed by capitalism as a mechanism of oppression. We have to promote the class awareness, gender awareness, also ethnic and homeland, in order to mobilize the peoples towards the option of anti-imperialist governors. We have to take on the lessons learned from COVID-19 that has unveil the capitalism and imperialism in its conception of human development versus economic development. And this is a quote: "In capitalist system, it is impossible to dismantle the exclusion and abuse of women because it has its basis in the anti-values of exclusion, male chauvinism, violence, and the degradation of values, and particularly those of women." This is said by Commander Hugo Chavez. Thank you. Thank you, Ivory. Now we're going to give the floor to Alicia Campos, who is the coordinator of the region of America and Latin America and the Caribbean of WIDF. Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Democratic Movement of Women here in Spain for their invitation to WIDF America, which is clearly very well represented here on this table for the world president, for one of the presidents of the continent, and also by the regional office. I am going to focus on the topic of the panel, topic of the panel, well, like every one of us, is the women's unity in the struggle against imperialism. However, that women's unity in the struggle against imperialism, we're going to try and describe it from the current situation of women in America and the Caribbean within this political context, current political context. And why? Well, because it is not possible that women get together to face imperialism if we don't get together from our structures, if we do not understand well what role we play within those structures, if we do not get stronger to go against all these contexts that we are facing today. So I'm going to read from Cuba, reminding our Jose Marti when he said, "Homeland is humanity." We'd like to greet the initiative of being able to get together and reflect on the current situation that we're experiencing, and also having the possibility of having common actions for a world where we globalize peace and solidarity. We are now attending a new geopolitical world recomposition in a scenario of serious threats to peace, a growing arm race, the upsurge of the Cold War, and also a protagonism of a key power poles. The world crisis that has been worsened by the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19, with its cyclical waves, continued worsening the structural imbalances, the inequality that has been imposed by neoliberal capitalism on humanity. This economical, social, and financial crisis that is hitting particularly the vulnerable minorities becomes worsened by the ecological degradation, the increase of migration flows, the international terrorism, the increase of regional conflicts and international conflicts. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have seen how the imperial offense of the right has been worsened, and that of the far right as well, against the left and progressive movement. And we have seen episodes of lack of governability and political instability and social upsurge. As to oppose to this, this is against the U.S. imperialism and what they try to impose in a lot of political and intellectual means. And they, the left, and the Bolivarian revolution stays strong in Venezuela, the democratic and cultural revolution in Bolivia, the Sandinistic process in Nicaragua that resists the North American aggression, and it also resists the internal counter-revolution, and also the Cuban revolution that continued its invariable and committed route towards socialism. And we have also seen the addition of other countries and other societies that are part of this process, and which is very similar. In this framework of fights to preserve the left experiences that are also progressive anti-imperialist, it becomes a political imperative to articulate unity and the most solid and consistent solidarity with each one of them. Imperialism and its allies aim to actually get totally the opposite. There are enough examples in the history of Latin America and countries in the Caribbean that state that when there is will, when there are clear goals to fight and there is a moral to fight, there will be many more options to counteract any revolutionary offense. And believe me, I'm saying this from my responsibility because this is our experience on a daily basis. The new file, the new situation is not currently worried about presenting arguments or justifications that are convincing. It doesn't hesitate when it comes to using the cynical statement and open statement of threats based on all types of pressures and on the use of force, including military force, with the reiteration of lies as ideological accompaniments of destabilizing strategy with the support of the technological and IT development. There are new formats in these subversive actions on civil society in Latin America, which are focused on their basis levels, both at a community and a territorial level. Once again, we call for public diplomacy, for the restatement of concepts like democratic transition, change of regime, failed states, etc., in order to legitimize the imperial influence and the neoliberalism. In this political context, to our region and the world, a pandemic arrived that has resulted in a lot of deaths and has a serious imprint in the psychological and physical health of individuals and families. And at the same time, the world has been facing, or sees itself facing, a serious financial crisis. The inability of many governments to act according to their responsibilities, we still see that in our daily practice, in their daily practice. Now, from the financial point of view, our region in Latin America and the Caribbean doesn't seem to be the most impacted one by the crisis. But despite the fact that the macro data reveal a situation of a better condition than in other regions, it is true that America is where we see the highest level of inequalities and the worst distribution of revenues. In our region, it becomes more and more visible, the feminization of poverty. It is women and girls, the ones that feel most impacted by the crisis, the pandemic, the wars, the forced disappearances, migrations, human trafficking, gender violence, intrafamily violence, the feminicides, etc., and the respect to their human rights. In 2021, the female participation rate in Latin America, employment-wise, was at 47.7%, whereas the male one was 71.5%. So therefore, there's been a strong slowdown of the female participation in employment. So many women that today need and want to work in Latin America have not been able to do so because of the domestic workload, and they now represent 11.8% of those that have asked, how would I say, they have expressed that they wanted to work and they've not been able to. In Latin America, the time of women dedicated to non-remunerated work at home represents 73%, and that of men is 27%. So for women working in the formal economy sector, there is the labor responsibilities through the modality that we almost had to take on because of the pandemic, telework, that was added to the daily life as a new form of neoliberal exploitation. Now, over 50% of women in the reproductive age work informally. Almost 40% work in the sector of goods and services, stores, restaurants, domestic work, the sectors that have been badly impacted by the effects of coronavirus. In this political context, women also fight for their human rights to be recognized, and they also fight against the gender inequality that increases as a result of the neoliberal policies. So in this growing social movement, women in America constitute a fundamental force, and the fight against patriarchy is one of the key axles, together with the anti-imperialism and anti-neoliberalism. Women have been always in the front line of the pandemic. Given the importance of care and the sustainability of life, women have paid a great contribution if we bear in mind that the care is mainly been in their hands. State institutionality, we know that contributes to gender inequality and lack of autonomy in women as a consequence of injustice, lack of equality in the access to resources, time, etc. Therefore, the sexual division of labor has for a long time supported the culture of privilege, which is patriarchal and violent. And non-remunerated work is mainly focused on women, which definitely implies that we need higher measures beyond GDP, because women's work also has a value. Gender inequality constitutes a structural trace in Latin America. Therefore, it is absolutely indispensable in order to understand this inequality as a structural element to make progress in the structural changes in order to achieve equality. So to achieve this necessary social change that promotes gender equality, we do need a change, with all due respect, in the model of development and in the social and economic model of our societies that puts at the core the autonomy of women and the sustainability of the environment. Women have also suffered another pandemic in the shadow, which is feminicide and other forms of violence. 1 out of 4 girls in 2021 got married before reaching the age of 16 in Latin America. And when this is not always very visible, this is an unacceptable violation of human rights. Therefore, it is most to transform the society so that the society cares for others and not only women. And it's fundamental also to bear in mind that in a context of emergency and disasters, all these inequalities become more and more obvious, those that already existed, and therefore the level of vulnerability of women and girls increase. This is an experience of violence that prevails. It says that women are being instrumentalized in order to justify wars. And also they are a key point of global capitalism, which is racist and sexist. The women are the cheapest labor, and they are in the manufacturers and the factories. They are undocumented. They are ready to take on non-remunerated and unsafe jobs. They are victims of violence, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, etc. And of course, these pandemic times that have given rise to furloughs and stops, the women have been the most impacted. Of course, everything I've said has a great impact in the awareness of women, who have become more and more aware of the multiple forms of violence and discrimination that affect them. In America and the Caribbean, women are the protagonists of a fight to build a better world that is based on solidarity, justice, and equality. Regardless of the plurality of ideas and lines of thought, they articulate themselves with a reference of common basis, which is the fight for peace against poverty, exclusion, and the need to reach full equality within the society and within the families. Well, within these forces that are acting in these processes and with different results, we have the associations that are affiliated to the WIDF. The International Democratic Association of Women that I coordinate in Cuba, we coordinate the work of 72 affiliated organizations of the region. And we today, as part of this summit, would like to, on behalf of those 72 organizations, to leave our repulse and condemn of the coercive measures and economic block to the brave people of Venezuela. This is one of our lines of combat in America. We condemn the fascist acts that are being performed by imperialism in our peoples. And believe me, what is currently happening in Ecuador is quite recent. What's happening in Salvador, in Guatemala, what's happening in Brazil, and in so many other Latin American regions. From this table, on behalf of my 72 associated organizations, I would like to call for the end of social leaders in Colombia in order to reach peace in Colombia. Fortunately, ultra-right didn't win in Colombia, but this is still an issue that it's outstanding. We want to demand the neoliberal regions of the region to look towards their peoples and respect the most fundamental human right, which is life, which now in America is not being respected. We need to express solidarity with all the just causes of the region and the rest of the world that face imperialism in order to revert the progress that we've achieved in terms of independence, sovereignty, and self-determination. I'd also like to call on behalf of the affiliated organizations to call the WIDF in America for solidarity for the just cause of women and people of Cuba, who for over half a century claim for the lifting of the inhuman block imposed by the government of the US, which is the key obstacle for their development. And it is an enormous violation of the human rights of these people and their women, who, in the middle of their existence, they don't only provide the humanitarian aid and their solidarity to all the peoples of the world, they also actively fight together with the rest of America and the Caribbean for the integration and the respect of for our region to be a zone of peace that has been stated by all the heads of state during the Salat summit in La Habana in January 2014. Let's not forget that peace is also a human right. Now, dear comrades, the empire does not understand love and humanism. Therefore, it also tries to block the hope of the peoples. Therefore, if I may, in 2 minutes, Cristina, as a Cuban woman, I would like to make a reference to my dear homeland. Our country is currently suffering, as I said before, in a terrible block. They wanted our people to surrender through hunger and need. However, our commitment to the defense of the revolution has meant that we overcome every need and offense in order to be successful and make progress in our political project, which is socialism, and we're not going to give up socialism. In Cuba, there are over 4 million female Cubans that are organized in a mass organization that Fidel called a revolution within another revolution. And I'm talking about the Federation of Cuban Women. This is a non-governmental organization that, because of its prestige, has a legislative initiative, and it is the mechanism of the Cuban state for the women's affairs. There is a political will in Cuba for the creation and a specification of public policies that promote the progress of women and also laws for their protection. We're now talking about the family code, and we're talking to another family code. It is going to, we're going to have a referendum on paternity and maternity law. So recently, we have signed a presidential decree with a national action program for the development of women. We have a national strategy. There's also a ministerial decree for the prevention of gender violence. And Cuban women always say that the key equality program in Cuba is revolution. Without the revolution, we wouldn't have been what we are today. Therefore, let's say that today women are 48% of the members of the State Council in Cuba. We are 53.4% of the MPs in the National Assembly, 22% of the political bureau of the Communist Party. We are 53% in the science sector. 48% of the scientists. We are 54.9% of the employees of the economic activity rate, 62% of the collaborators of the health industry who take their love and science to save anyone, anywhere in the world, and we are over 60% of the professionals of the country.
The consequence, there is much a country can do for its people when there is true political willingness and commitment. And so we always ask ourselves in Cuba, if we have achieved all this with a blockade, imagine what we could achieve, what this revolution could achieve if the United States stopped trying to strangle us for the mere fact of trying to defend our freedom, our dignity, and live, as the poet said, at any cost. So, comrades, let us make this a reunion, a space for political reflection to strengthen the need for unity, the strengthening of our structures and a way to show our solidarity with all the peoples and countries around the world who face war, exploitation, and imperial genocide. For WIDF, this is also a time for commitment to grow with young women committed to our purposes to guarantee the continuity of the organization and the positioning worldwide as a reference point in the struggle against imperialism and patriarchy. In an international context that's highly complex with profound changes, we need to continue working for ideology and political action taken into account, comrades, that our struggle will never be understood or accepted by the oligarchies, who will not stop creating strategies to destroy any progressive revolutionary process and will continue to place hurdles along the way of internal renewal. So, no matter where we come from in the world, our struggle is but one. There's one single enemy to destroy, which is imperialism and capitalism, and we have learned imperialism and capitalism generate various types of oppression on women, who are not just class oppressions, but also race-related and sex-related oppressions. The emancipation of women goes hand in hand with the liberation of the whole population, which is why we say there is no potential victory and gender equality without class struggle. We also need to be united in action and show solidarity in constant struggle for the world peace. Please, apologies if I went over time a little bit. Thank you so much, Alicia. We're going to now give the floor to the last panelist, Lorena Peña, who is the world president of WIDF. Good afternoon. I want to thank WIDF and all of you for your presence here today in this very important meeting, where we are reflecting and also declaring our rejection of war. We're declaring we're in favor of peace and against NATO on all the war-waging imperialistic policy. By insisting upon certain notions, I'll just help underscore a few ideas. As everybody explained here, WIDF has, right from the start, linked to seeking out peace, linked to the self-determination of the peoples against fascism, which is one of the most brutal discrimination and exclusion policies there are, and the struggle for our rights as women, for our rights to emancipate. For us, this comes hand in hand with the fight for the self-determination with regards to our lives and our bodies, and this is related to the right for self-determination of the peoples. How could a people be self-determined if half of the population has no control over their bodies? Obviously, these two struggles are linked, intertwined. On the other hand, it would appear impossible to think about a life free of violence for women under the scourge of war, forced migration and persecution. Therefore, for us, fighting against the patriarchal, criminal, capitalist system is an obligation if we are to establish the positive conditions to exercise our fundamental rights, decent work, health and reproductive and sexual rights, free sexual options, rights to the social services, a right to work and a right to leisure, also right to political participation. All these demands and aspirations by women around the world are impossible when fascism and war are imposed in our countries. That's all impossible within a capitalist system framework. For instance, the right to enjoy our body, which is a fundamental right. Imagine for a woman who's working at a maquila after 14 hours of work, what kind of enjoyment of her own body is she going to have? We cannot separate the exploitation conditions to other rights. This is why the socialist feminists organized within WIDF reject those capitalist governments and militarist governments and which with the US attack those peoples that do not serve their interests for political and economic domination. Throughout this time, as we all know, once again, this military alliance has pushed into death and desolation a big section of Europe, generating with it a danger for a world confrontation and a food crisis with no precedent, even though we could see that food crisis coming. Having said that, undoubtedly it'll be even worse in these conditions, and even worse for those countries colonized, such as El Salvador. I come from El Salvador. In El Salvador, beans which we produce ourselves and corn are already very expensive, but not even that. Bread, all kinds of food products have experienced tremendous hikes of prices, and the president put together a committee to solve the world crisis, he called it, to just give the impression he was going to solve that crisis. The impact of the war is a worldwide impact, that's undeniable. And so what they are doing at the borders with Russia, something they've already done in Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine, and other places. They've done this to other peoples, as Regina pointed out. And the crime these peoples have committed is to even reach strategic areas rich in natural resources, or perhaps areas through which the transportation routes for those goods go. And of course, as good patriarchal machos, they are unable to come up with anything new. The NATO-US recipe continues to be the same ever since patriarchy started. The only way they can imagine to secure cooperation is by way of violence, imposition, war, weapons, and domination. This is why it is so important to question this patriarchal approach to politics, without forgetting, of course, all other elements that have been mentioned, the class considerations and so on. But this is not a new invention. Every time these oppressive patriarchal regimes need something, they do the same. They do not talk. They go into war. They try and dominate. They exert violence. Exactly like patriarchal husbands. The logic behind it is exactly the same. It is sad, but it is true. And I mention this because it would appear as if these are not topics for such a serious summit, but they are, if we do not promote a change in the mindset within the progressive forces, and questioning of the system. Solutions will always be limited. In my country, for instance, in El Salvador, going by that same patriarchal logic, the gangs, organized crime, and the government are really exerting violence against the impoverished peoples. Have you heard about the Salvador gangs? They are frightening, but I question whether they are any different to NATO. Is NATO any different? Is the US government any different? The logic they operate by is exactly the same. They are just the same thing. They are different ways of, the same way of solving problems. It is a resolution with violence against, again, I insist, war, kidnappings, forced displacements, murder, and of course, the heaviest load falls on women and small children, boys and girls, who suffer the most the impact of wars. And this war, as everybody's mentioned already, is terrible because the corpses and the economic cost falls on the people, whereas these companies and the states share in the profits, the spoils, and the territories. So it is fundamental to study in greater depth all this to try and conceptualize better how war and patriarchy are brothers. They are part of one same way of doing politics. In the face of the tremendous world crisis, given the resurgence of these fascist groups and armed conflicts and the dire consequences that all this entails for the peoples, on the 17th Congress we had in April this year in Caracas, we decided, and we want to put forward these initiatives for us all to defend them, we decided to promote a worldwide initiative against fascism in the world with a gender perspective. This, of course, calls for thinking, mobilizing, and hard work, of course, but we consider that's not enough to just raise our voices against fascism and for peace, but we must move forward towards a new approach to human security, as all comrades have mentioned, and we need to better conceptualize what is it that we're talking about when we say we want fairer, more peaceful society. So one of our biggest resolutions is this one. We're determined to see this through. This is an initiative in favor of peace against fascism, in favor of our rights with a gender perspective. Likewise, during this Congress, we also decided in April this year to demand, and we want to express it here, to demand the closure of the military bases that imperialism has established in all continents, and to demand the dissolution of NATO, the dismantling of NATO. We do not need military alliances. It's enough with the problems we already have. We must not maintain useless organizations that only generate hunger and desolation. Our Congress also ratified its opinion that all controversies must be solved peacefully. And we promote a political solution to the conflict between NATO and Ukraine and Russia on the other side. Since our first Congress in 1945, WIDF has established how its struggle is not only against war, but also against the causes of war, which is why we suggest we put together a worldwide unity of women to fight for our equality and our emancipation, directly linked to the struggle against imperialistic wars and the policies that generate fascism. Likewise, we need to fight against environmental destruction as part of this effort. We do not want a world divided by high walls with all sorts of armed fortresses, ravaged by hatred and civilization clashes. Stopping war now, stopping all wars, is our first political goal in a time such as this, and WIDF is committed to contribute in every possible manner to the building of a new polycentric and multipolar worldwide order for shared solutions, political, economic, cultural and scientific cooperation for the well-being of humanity and the survival of the planet. This is why we feel if we are united in our diversity, we can undoubtedly contribute to build this multipolar, peaceful, fair, equitable, democratic world. And when we talk about the women of the planet united in their diversity, we're thinking about socialists who are feminists and non-feminists or non-socialists, okay? We need to really open up, being very clear that from our position we'll try and meet other women with this shared objective to fight for a peaceful, fair world, an equitable world, a democratic world. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Lorena, and everybody else. We'd have half an hour. We do have half an hour still, don't we? Is it up until 6? so that you can ask all the questions you want to ask. So if there are any questions, the panelists are here, happy to respond to any question there may be. You need to use a microphone, please. And going by the indications I've been given, you need to go over there to that corner to ask your question. Any questions, anybody? Yes? Are there any questions? Where's the microphone?
Sí, es por el micro, por la traducción, ¿no?
Well, my name is Ann Wright, and I'm from the United States, and I'm with Code Pink Women for Peace and Veterans for Peace. And on behalf of our delegation from the United States, Paqui Whalen over here, we would like to apologize to the people of Cuba for all of the trouble we've caused, and to the people of Venezuela, and to the people of Nicaragua, and to the people of the world for all the trouble that we've caused. And Paqui and I have been to Cuba many times. Paqui has been to Venezuela, and we are trying our best to keep our government out of everyone else's business, but we're not being too successful, but we are going to try. And then I would just like to mention, I really appreciate what the organization has done for many, many years, because your organization sent a delegation to North Korea after or during the Korean War to document all the things that were happening to the people of Korea. And it was one of the only honest reports that came out of the Korean War. So thank you all very much for all you represent. Thank you.
Thank you. ¿Alguien más?
Anybody else wants to ask questions or to make any comments?
¿Más? Sí.
Permiso. Permite decirme.
Please allow me to say, even though we're about to finish our panel, Alicia has just joined us from, she represents the Sahara Uyghurs, and Gloria Lara from Colombia, and Yanira Cooper, and Marisela from El Salvador also, and Yanira Cooper from Cuba. They are all WIDF comrades. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. If there are no further comments, there's a question over there. The microphone's over here. Good afternoon. First, I want to thank these wonderful women to be here sharing such good ideas. We are in almost total agreement with everything I've heard from you. But I would like to ask, even though I've loved most of the things I've heard, but I would like to ask, in a summit against NATO, against war, against patriarchy, against capitalism, what I would ask is, what is your view right now on what's happened in the United States after 50 years? They've banned free of charge, free abortion. This is a way of crushing half of humanity, and also a warning sign against women around the world.
Sorry about that. I'm Leija Launukari. I'm coming from Finland, from Women for Peace. I really thank you all in the panel. It was great to hear that you are working so much. I would really like to have the contacts of you so that we can work further together. We have, you probably know that Finland is stepping forward to get the membership in NATO. And that is really, really difficult and hard for peacekeeping people to work. So we have get together a lot of lists from all over the world, from organizations that support new presentation for having the OCE conference in Finland, probably in Finland, I don't know, maybe in Ireland or Germany or Austria. But I thank you very much, and I really like to have the contacts and that you support also our work. Thank you.
Sí, Yadietu.
Yadietu, go ahead. You need to use the mic if you'd be so kind. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this platform for peace and all the women organizations that have made such an effort to visualize the struggles of women around the world. My question is this. We all know that we are part of several different organizations, women's organizations in countries around the world. All of us, regardless of our culture, our problems, in our respective countries, have one shared goal, which I feel is far more galvanizing than anything else, which is beyond the rights of women, which is peace. Because peace is the true guarantee of peaceful coexistence, not only between men and women, but also among nations and states. And so making the most of this summit and this event against this war machinery that solves conflicts by way of confrontation and weapons and arms instead of by way of words and negotiated, fair, durable solutions that guarantee the coexistence of nations and peoples, where we feel safe as people, as individuals, and as human beings. And so the question would be, what could we do? What could women organizations do so that our voices join and together we all raise our voices one before the United Nations, because we're all working in our countries in different organizations in different ways, but this is always a peaceful struggle, and yet we're overlooked. United Nations, with the governments, the presidents of the countries, do not pay attention to us. Where are the women to be found in this organization? So I suggest we put forward a proposal so that a group representing women's movements globally with a structure by continents and also global structure. I would suggest that we have representation in the United Nations and in the big international organizations, so that not only the voice of the governments and the prime ministers, but also our voice is heard, particularly because they are always men. I would like to say something. We're very seriously working on this worldwide initiative for peace against fascism with a gender perspective, which should be the engine pulling forward a campaign to demand new commitments for peace to different governments, and this should be an element that could lend itself useful for mobilization worldwide. Beyond that, WIDF is member of the ECOSOC with a consulting status at the UN. Yet, as I mentioned to Cristina, this is pointless. It's pointless to have the space if we have no sound proposals to bring forward, which is why on this occasion we have given ourselves the goal to really put together, draft something that is more comprehensive and structured, that can be criticized, given feedback to, and fine-tuned to really reflect the realities in the different countries, and to launch this campaign. I feel this could be a good space for that. At the same time, our space is at your service for any other particular declarations, country by country, but we feel this worldwide campaign against fascism, against the war, is urgent. We must take on this challenge now. We are really outraged. For several years now, we've seen how when a war ends, another war starts, or some war doesn't really end, is like frozen, hibernating, and yet another war starts in another country. And so there is a slowly but surely this recolonization of the world that crushes the possibilities for the peoples to live in a different world with peace and justice, which is why we feel it is now that we must launch this campaign. Any further comment?
Well, on the abortion, what we do support and we do fight for the depenalization of abortion, for a voluntary maternity that is free and safe. That thing that has happened in the US is one more evidence of how conservative and extreme right approaches are becoming stronger and stronger, and we must see it within that context. And it must be a warning for all of us, because there are countries where, for example, in my country, still abortion is fully penalized, despite the fact that there is a strong mobilization for the depenalization of abortion. But it's even more serious that countries that for decades have had this right now start moving backwards. The truth is that, well, I have a Marxist background, and I used to think that the wheel of history moved always forward and forward unavoidably. But we see that sometimes the wheel, if we're not watching, it starts going backward. So the option is that we must always be fighting in order to defend what we already have and in order to keep on conquering. Because as soon as we stop watching, the monster turns up again. Well, I'm going to keep a sentence that comrades said. They said an alert that walks against the rights of the women on the world. And they're moving forward. We see them in Europe. They make progress. And I must say that in Barcelona, where there was a counter summit that we organized it last weekend, and I took part on a table as a democratic movement for women, and also WIDF in Spain, and I made a proposal, or I suggested a summit for peace, which is a summit for life from a feminist approach, because it is necessary that women unify for peace and for the fight against imperialism and in order to stop wars. Because the truth is that those who know about life is women, because we generate life and because we know the value of life. And therefore, it's very important that we work on this direction, that we set out a goal, and that goal being that summit for peace, that it becomes an international women's summit, so that women can stop wars and solve conflicts, always respecting the sovereignty of the peoples and ensuring human rights of all individuals, of everyone. I think that we need to work and leave this meeting, women, the feminist women, anti-imperialist women, anti-capitalist women. We need to leave this place with the idea of working so that the next March the 8th is a day where there is a lot of mobilization, just like in 2018 in Spain, but with one goal. And the goal should be peace. And that is why it is important to start working on that Summit for Life, which is ultimately a summit for peace and not the summit, or not the NATO summit, which will take place next weekend, which is the summit for death. And we do not want, women do not want that summit. And so perhaps here we conclude, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending and for your participation. Thank you very much.